Welcome to Heart with Keisha B, the podcast that focuses on the journey of grief, healing, and overcoming unforeseen circumstances. Whether you're dealing with loss or life challenges, this is a podcast that you don't want to miss. I am your host, Keisha B. So take a deep breath, open your mind and your soul, and sit back as we embark on this journey together. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Heart to Heart with Keisha B. And as you all know, each week I always have a special guest to come on to share their life experiences. Candace received her Doctor of Education degree, Educational Leadership from Argosy University in 2013, her MA in Mental Health Counseling from Marshall University in 2006, and her BA in Psychology in 2004. Also from Marshall University. Candace is licensed in the state of West Virginia as a licensed professional counselor. She is a certified peer educator, training instructor, certified trainer in QPR question, persuade, referred suicide prevention, training, as well as certified as a TIPS for university training. She enjoys teaching as an adjunct instructor in counseling and psychology. Candace has 15 years of counseling experience in many different counseling and human service environments, and 10 years of experience working with youth and adults in community-based foster care, residential, private practice, higher education, and K-12 school-based services. I'm here to tell you, this woman has a lot of experiences that I'm sure today when you listen to her, you'll see why she is a guest on Heart to Heart with Keisha B. Hello, Candace. How are you today?
Hello. Doing good. Thanks for having me.
Candace, thank you. We're delighted today to have you here on, again, another episode of Heart to Heart. As we talk about why we are here today, we're here because today's episode, Healing Through the Hurt, a therapist's tools for overcoming grief and life trials. I listened to all of your accolades. I listened to all of your experiences that you have. And I know for certain that you are going to bring the fire today and you're going to educate our listeners on the importance of seeking additional support when dealing with grief, healing, as well as overcoming unforeseen circumstances. So as we talk about who you are, I want to give you this space to talk about the importance of just, getting that extra support when they're dealing with something that's so unfamiliar to them.
Grief is a very lonely place oftentimes, and it often leads people to isolate and think, no one's going to understand, and sometimes it leads to a variety of emotions, even jealousy. Sometimes a person might think they still have a parent or a child or so-and-so. And so it brings about so many of those emotions. And so it's so important to seek support through that, someone who is trained and able to assist you, because having that support is so important so that you don't begin to isolate. Grief can bring about depression, anxiety. It can bring about adjustment disorder, which is basically, prior to this life situation, you didn't have any mental health symptoms. And then boom, something unfortunate, terrible happens. And then you have these symptoms. So there's just a variety of diagnoses and symptoms that can come about. So it's really important to seek a counselor that you have your own space, your own time. It's confidential, away from family, because they're also grieving as well. So family can't be grieving together and being each other's counselors. They can be support, but they're not counselors. And so it's so important to reach out and get support through grief.
Even though you may have your family as your support, they too are grieving. But as we know, oftentimes when we look at just walking into a therapist space, that can be very uncomfortable. How do we start this conversation of moving from what is your support system that you are accustomed to and comfortable with to walking into yet an unfamiliar space of someone that's a stranger?
It's important to make sure, you find a fit for you. Everyone isn't everyone's cup of tea. So every, counselor isn't going to be fit for everyone. And so knowing if you prefer male or female, knowing if you want someone that is ethnic racial minority, or maybe you want a counselor that's LGBTQ plus focused or friendly, which they should all be friendly, but maybe they are certified in that area. Knowing that about yourself is going to help that process a lot better. Knowing if you prefer in-person versus virtual. I have some clients sometimes and they're like, oh, they just can't stand virtual. I have some clients that like to lay in their bed with their
Mm-hmm.
laptop and be comfy in their own home, and that's what they enjoy. So I think knowing yourself and knowing what you'd prefer is going to help a person be more comfortable in that setting.
Yeah, good advice. So, Candace, as a therapist, you work with many people, right, that are navigating
Mm-hmm.
loss and are really deep in that pain of grief. What do you see some of the biggest misconceptions about grief and healing process?
I do want to say that, there's no proper like timeline. There's no like textbook way to grieve. And I think people think that. I've heard
Mm-hmm.
people say, well, I shouldn't still be crying, or I shouldn't still be reacting this way, or I still shouldn't be doing this. And now, granted, now after a lot of years, if 10 years has passed and not much have changed, then that's something we got to talk about.
Right.
But, again, there's no specific timeline for people. And I think people feel like they need to have this cookie cutter experience to grief, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not that way.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone grieves differently. I know people who, which I wouldn't recommend, but that's best for them. They lose someone, they go back to work the next week. If I lose a parent, or, I'm out for a while. I'm gonna be out for a couple of weeks. So I mean,
Yeah.
that's me. Everyone's different, but I think recognizing that a lot of complex emotions can come about,
Mm-hmm.
and that it's okay to express those, especially for men. Men feel like they gotta be the strong person for everyone, and that's not true. They don't have to be the strong guy throughout
Mm-hmm.
grief.
Candace, I can remember when I lost my significant other in 2018. And after the service, I immediately went back to work on that Monday. And I'm going to
Wow.
tell you something. I thought I was ready. And thankfully, I had a coworker that had advocated for me and went to my boss and said, she can't be here. She has to go home. And I
Mm-hmm.
am so grateful for that, because I didn't recognize it at that moment, because I was so tied into my job and just happened to do work that I didn't realize that grief wasn't going to
Mm-hmm.
allow me to do that. It wasn't going to allow me to be effective. So thankful that you're saying to people that just take time to process.
Mm-hmm.
Again, processing periods may look different for people, but jumping right back into work sometimes may not be the best. And I personally know that for my own self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think knowing that and knowing just yourself is important as you navigate grief.
Hmm. So, Candace, that sort of takes me into, as we continue to talk about grief, grief sometimes can make you feel feelings of guilt, regret, or even self blame. How do you, as a professional, help clients address these complex emotions?
I think it's helping a client move to today. I don't like to say let's move on, because that's, will the person ever really move on? No. They change, their life has changed and they learn how to function. But I think it's important that we move to today. What I find a lot of times in grief, and just even in my own experience, that like we get stuck in that day that person passed
Hmm.
away. And the day my grandmother passed away was 20 some years ago, but I can remember specific things. I can remember smells, who was there. I mean,
Hmm.
everything. And very traumatic and emotional memories stick to us
Hmm.
oftentimes. And so,
Yeah.
what I find is that people stick in that day or that week or whatever the time period that person passed. We
Hmm.
forget all those memories from before, and we forget how we can remember that person today. And we stick
Hmm.
on that day or that week, of our mourning and our grief process and when it initially happened. And so I try to work with people on reframing and changing things about the grief in your head.
Hmm.
You know,
And sometimes that can be tough.
oh, so tough. So tough. And it's not saying, I want you to forget it or you're never going to remember it again. It's always going to be there. But I think,
Hmm.
for example, say, someone you passed, when I think about my grandmother, I want to think about us drinking coffee together, not
Hmm.
watching her in that hospital bed, which is a memory. And so, what we
Right.
would help clients to do is when you think of Granny, let's reframe those initial thoughts. Yeah, you might still go down that rabbit hole of grief, and you need to process that and express it.
Hmm.
But what I want you to do initially is try to think, okay, what did I enjoy about Granny's life?
Right.
We get so focused on the death, we forget a person's life. And that's not easy to do. And that's why there's no timeline. But
Hmm.
definitely, I think helping a person work through every individual emotion they're experiencing, that's something I do in therapy. We'll go through, okay, let's write down all the emotions you're experiencing. And anger. Okay, what makes you feel angry? okay, sadness. What makes you feel sadness? I think it's important to go through each of them, but
Mm-hmm.
also help them move to today. And then tomorrow
Right.
we work on being in today. And then each day,
Mm-hmm.
it's just day by day trying to be today.
Mm-hmm. So what I hear you saying, Candace, is just being very intentional about the process that you're going through.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Even in your moments of loneliness, it's just still being very intentional. And it seems like not just getting caught up in, like you say, all the things that may cause you additional pain.
Mm-hmm.
So I know I called you Candace. I'm gonna say Dr. Layne, right? I'm gonna give you the credit in which you are
Mm-hmm.
due. So Dr. Layne, how do you approach helping someone build resilience? That's a strong word, right? Because sometimes people don't even think
Oh,
that
it
they can
is.
get to that point. But how do you help someone
Mm-hmm.
approach to build their resilience and inner strength?
I work with people on recognizing that resiliency does not mean just being tough. We
Mm,
think that, it doesn't just mean grit and making yourself fight through the trenches and, being glorious through it all. That's not what resiliency is. Resiliency is learning how to manage. So
mhm,
we want to work on emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence also involves being self aware. Okay. How do
mhm,
I express emotions? Am I a naturally sensitive person or easily jealous person? Am
mhm,
I an easy bitterness person? And that's, even just me being self-aware. I think that, in some really strong core depths, I might be bitter for some
mhm,
parts of
mhm,
it because I know
mhm,
myself. And so
mhm,
I think we want people to learn yourselves. How do you express emotions? How do you grieve? Let's work on you learning your emotions. Some people, when they're sad, they immediately express it through anger or frustration, but
mhm,
really they're
right,
sad.
mhm,
So I think helping a person learn that so that they can learn how to cope when they have those episodes, when those episodes
yeah,
come. So that resiliency is skills, resiliency is self awareness, resiliency
mhm,
is being able to use skills and strategies and mental performance pretty much to get through the day and get through a life experience. And so
mhm.
learning that resiliency doesn't just mean that you're strong and tough, but it's so much more than that.
Yeah. Candace, when I think about the life altering experience that my 9-year-old son had to go through when he lost his father, and obviously that was a big death for him. I can recall, and sometimes I still even do this, that when we're in different settings and I see children with their fathers, even though I never have asked my son the question, internally I always wonder if there, let's go to the word that you use, if there could be a sense of jealousy and sadness that he may
Mm-hmm.
experience because he may see a child with their parent, even a kid that looked to be 9, or even a kid that's now his age, that's a teenager. And maybe now that you're saying that, I'm now wondering as a parent if maybe I should
Mm-hmm.
process that with him as a parent, and also give him the opportunity to process that in a setting of someone that's neutral.
Yeah, it's okay to acknowledge that it's okay that you're jealous that your best friend still has her parents, or
Mhm,
you're jealous, like, like your son, I seeing all these other kids with their dads. And so acknowledging that feeling
mhm,
and that
mhm.
emotion. And
Yeah.
it is okay to feel that. It's normal.
Yeah. I think you're using a good word, or a very strong word that our listeners need to hear, that grief is normal. Processing grief
Hmm.
is normal. All the different stages that come with that, that's normal. And don't feel bad when these stages are coming up, because again, they're not linear. I've said this a few times in some of my other episodes, is that we hear the word stage, and sometimes that can be a misconception, because when we're thinking of stages, we're thinking of layers, and we have all these layers in our head, but a stage can come at any different moment. These symptoms of grief can come in any given moment, not in any set order.
Right. Yeah. And you can get through one and then have two at the same time, or get to one and go back through another. So yeah, good point.
We talk about unexpected or unforeseen circumstances. The word is just that, something that you may have not been prepared for, right? Whether it's death, whether
Hmm.
it's losing a job, whether it's a relationship that you were so tied into and then abruptly it's gone. It can feel like your whole entire world is just out of whack. So if I were to
Hmm.
walk into your office with this unexpected challenge, walk me through what Dr. Layne would do to make me feel like I'm going to be okay.
First thing, in a counseling environment, we want to, explain that it's confidential. And I think people need to know that first, foremost, that this will not be shared. You are safe here. It is a safe space. Also, letting them know that they're in control. And so I would also start by seeking out their needs. Like, what do you feel like you need? Yeah, I'm here to help guide you and help you develop goals, and we're going to learn strategies. And then we'll begin to develop goals and determine just a plan of action for therapy. I'll also I would assess where they are currently in the grief process. Like we said, there is no specific stage that, we can just place people in, but seeing where they're at. Maybe they're experiencing depression and anger. Maybe they're withdrawing. Maybe they kind of did what you did, like, oh, I can just go back, I'm fine. Maybe there's a little denial in there. And so I want to assess where they're at and how their functioning is. And that'll help guide us towards the goals and towards working on, how to help them improve their functioning as they grieve.
I'm going to shift gears just a tad bit. As you know, culturally, and I'm going to speak of the African American culture, sometimes it still is a sense of taboo that African Americans reach out for mental health services. And as we know, grief has no color, grief has no age, healing has no color, healing has no age. What would be your advice to African American listeners when it comes to breaking that cycle of what goes on in the home stays in the home, and or take it to God? What would be the approach to take when we're talking to our African American listeners of the importance of seeking additional support?
I often ask people, what would you do if a family member was having chest pains? You take them to the ER, right? No question. Mental health is the same. And I try to educate, especially ethnic racial minorities, because we are very proud. Even Appalachians in our area here in West Virginia and Ohio and abroad, in Appalachia, but we like to just suck it all down, suck it in, and we're fine. But recognizing that there are numerous benefits to counseling, and I always try to encourage or remind people that you can be a Christian and still seek out medical help and therapeutic counseling help. You can still have God in both. You can even go and find you a spiritual Christian counselor if that, assists. Right. But I always encourage people, and I try to explain the realness of mental health and mental illness. I'll start throwing stats out. I love talking about mental health, but recognizing, mental illness is generational, and it can be passed down genetically. It can be passed down through trauma. And it's important that if we keep ignoring it, our generations are going to continue having depressed, continue being in addiction, and continuing going through these concerns. So I often confront them on that sense and say, hey, don't you want to stop this within your family? Even if we don't want to acknowledge it's depression, addiction, or, bipolar or schizophrenia or other diagnoses, we know something there. So let's work to stop the generational trends and cycles of it. And it starts with you seeking help, you recognizing that mental illness is real, and you getting help for yourself as well, but also opening that conversation in family. So I just try to educate and help people understand that it truly is real, and that there's nothing to be embarrassed about, and that you wouldn't do anything different if it was a physical health issue.
Thank you for that, because what you've done for our listeners is to be able to show the parallel between medical, what one knows to be, whether it's a heart attack, whether it's diabetes, to therapy. That's also medical. They're both medical, right? They're both a sense of making sure that whatever the ailment may be, finding the help necessary to get better for whatever it is that you're dealing with prior to seeking the help. So it's normalizing the understanding that counseling is normal. Counseling is okay. And it's okay to say, I need help.
Oh, yeah. And you don't have to have a mental health diagnosis or be I call it the C word, or be crazy. I don't like to use that term, but to go, you don't have to be that to see a counselor. Counseling is for everyone, and it actually is very beneficial. And research proves that it is. Just venting and getting things out to another person that's trained can be beneficial in itself.
So let's talk about, you have that client in your office and they come because they recognize that something is wrong. I'm ready to seek help. But then there comes that moment in counseling, Dr. Layne, where it begins to get uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
right? It begins to get very, very uncomfortable to where that person feels like that they're ready to run. Walk us
Mm-hmm.
through when you recognize as a trained therapist, you see that uncomfortable moment for that client. How do you work towards reassuring this client that being uncomfortable is common and it's okay to still remain here?
I try to find out what it is that's causing them to feel uncomfortable and kind of hit a roadblock, sort of, speaking, and what is it that I can do to help them feel more comfortable in the environment.
Hmm.
Oftentimes, it's just they're not ready to confront those emotions because they're too heavy and too hard.
Yeah.
Sometimes people don't want to cry in front of the therapist. So I also try to give them time and let them know, hey, we don't have to go through that today. We can hold on that. Now we got to come back to it at some point. But for now, we don't have to go down that road if you're not ready. But eventually, we need to. And so I think
Mhm.
reminding them and the client that they are in control of therapy. I'm just the trained one that kind of helps navigate. And if they're not ready to cross that bridge yet, we don't
Mhm.
have to. But I'm a very solution focused therapist. I'm very action oriented. So I try to remind people that even if we don't want to go down that road, we got to go down another one because we got to stay.
Yeah.
If solution focused is appropriate, strategies for them, which it can work for most diagnoses and concerns. The solution focus for grief wouldn't be getting over the grief. The solution focus would be working towards a way that you can function again. That's,
Right.
finding solutions for that. But, that's what we would work on is, we don't have to go there now, but how can we help you get through it when it's time?
So, Dr. Layne, just listening to you speak, it sounds like that you are very intentional about meeting the client where they are. And something that you said was very impactful to me was that the client is in control of their own therapy. And I think that's a very important message, for individuals to hear, because again, as we know, sometimes people are so resistant of going into a therapist because of some of the misconceptions and or because of past experiences they may have had. So thank you again, for the work that you're doing with the people here in the community. And definitely, like I said, meeting people where they are, I think is very important to do when someone is walking into a session to talk about something that's very personal to them.
Thank you.
So that leads me to my next question, Dr. Layne. When we continue to unravel this space that's yet so uncomfortable for people, even if they've been in therapy for years, topics can still be very uncomfortable to navigate, even when they have
Yeah.
trust with their therapist. So the question here is that when life at times throws someone a curveball, right? As we know, it can get you stuck in the cycle of the why me, how did this happen to me? But as a therapist, how do you shift that person's mindset from that place of why me?
I'm a big CBT, and that's cognitive behavioral therapy, and I use it on myself every day, including mindfulness. And that includes watching what's in your brain. I call it stinking thinking. I try to make
Mhm.
sure that I control stinking thinking. We all have it every day at some point, maybe even if it's just, once or twice, but at some points we have that, but we have to learn to control it. And so, what I try to work with the client, especially in grief, is
Mhm.
what are those consistent thought patterns? How are you usually thinking the course of your day, even beyond like when you're not even thinking on the grief? What's in your mind? And so I like to work towards the client on that. I also work with clients on, we often compare ourselves, and especially with social media, this is the time of
Mm,
comparison, and it will beat a person down, and
you got
and
that right.
it will, oh my gosh, it will cause a person to get on. I mean, I've done it myself and been like, how they get that house? I mean, that's none of my business how they got that house. And
Exactly.
I mean people's pocketbooks and everything. But the same thing can happen in our personal lives, even with grief, is that comparison or that jealousy comes in, that anger.
Mhm.
Why me? Why do they get to have their parents, or why are they getting to enjoy this holiday? So I
Right.
often ask clients, what are you viewing? What's in your environment? Who
Mhm.
is in your environment? Because external things can cause us so much internally. And so that can also trigger some negative aspects of grief that,
Mhm.
are really hard. And so it can also trigger irrational thinking.
Mhm.
And so I like to examine a client's thinking patterns and then
Mhm.
try to help them through those life obstacles and those adjustments that we all have to go through at some point. Grief is something we'll all experience at some point.
Right.
And it definitely does take a person through that time of why me.
You know, Dr. Layne, as you and I both know, having a background myself in therapy as a therapist, what we all know it to be is self-talk, right? Telling yourself
Oh
things
yeah.
that's irrational or not, but many times
Mm-hmm.
our brain sometimes it's easy to focus in on the negative because it's easier, right? Versus
Mm-hmm.
just staying there in the positive. And so what I hear you saying is cognitive behavior therapy, training the individual how to speak differently to themselves, how to
Mm-hmm.
appreciate the positive side of them versus
Most
shifting to
definitely.
that negative, which is so easy to do sometimes.
And it's a change. It's a new change for that person. It's a new life. Living without this person or this. Whatever they're grieving and living without
Hmm.
that. And so it's a big change. So acknowledging the change, acknowledging that it is difficult, and it is okay to feel this way. But
Hmm.
how can we begin to change some of those thinking patterns and that may be stunning us a little bit and causing us to not be able to work through the grief?
Hmm. So is it fair to say, Dr. Layne, that it's not so much that the situation is not real, right? It's about changing your mindset on how to deal with the situation that is real.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Mhm.
It's having to have grit at sometimes, but also having to have emotions sometimes and work through them. In practice, it's learning to, self-awareness, helping a person learn, who I am and how do I deal with things,
Hmm.
and acknowledging that a person might be sensitive, and that's okay. A person might be easily jealous about things, and that's okay. But it's okay. We have to learn about us and how we respond so that we
Hmm.
can begin to heal and learn resiliency. So working through self-awareness, working through skill building, helping a person, I call it doing the opposite, or not I call it, I use it's a strategy called doing the opposite, doing the complete opposite of what you would normally do. And
Right.
so, in a time that maybe you might normally freak out about something, maybe in that moment, try to see if you can turn it into something humorous, as long as it's within normal limits and safety. But see if you can just do something completely opposite. What we're wanting to do is change behaviors. What we're wanting to do is change that person's instant brain response and reaction to
Hmm.
not be resilient, to do something that may not encompass resiliency. And so what we're trying to do is helping that person learn how to respond to things differently, learning new coping skills and
Hmm.
strategies, learning new ways to process through stress, and
Right.
practicing, actually including those practices and change behaviors in day to day, and beginning to learn how to use emotional intelligence and emotional regulation. That is huge. That is a big part of resiliency.
Hmm.
Learning and understanding your emotions, but learning also how to deal and process. That's so big. And so working through those in therapy are also aspects of resiliency.
Right. Which would be very helpful when those triggers come about, right? Because as we know, grief is
Hmm.
tricky. Triggers can come up at
Oh
any given
yes,
moment when you least expect it,
anytime.
whether it's, yeah, whether it's a smell, whether it's a picture, whether it's just anything, right? Because I always say our brains are like, I always use the analogy that our brains are like a Polaroid picture, that even when we
Hmm.
try to forget something, right, that picture is still there,
Oh yeah.
that even when you think back to old grandma's picture, her photo album, and there's these cracked Polaroid pictures. But when you really look deep in those pictures, you still can recognize some of those people that were there. And I always compare that
Hmm.
to grief and healing, that even when you may try to forget or may not remember everything, a trigger
Yeah.
can bring it all forward. So just having that sense of resiliency, I think, is definitely important. And like you say, when someone is in the process of healing through their grief process.
Hmm.
So that leads me to asking the question, Dr. Layne. I come into your office, I'm ready, right? But I know I
Hmm.
can't see you all the time. I know that therapy at some point is going to end, whether it's because I've met that treatment goal process. I'm at a place to where Dr. Layne says, Keisha, you're better. We're at a place where I feel comfortable saying you have completed your treatment. What tools would you give me and techniques do you think will be important for me when I don't see Dr. Layne that I can implement in my day-to-day life?
I like to recommend journaling. I think journaling is important. Now, if a person is interested in that, and that's something that they find. I like to call coping strategies or things that help us feel better our goodie bag. And I ask clients, what are things you want to put in your goodie bag? And so we have to figure out who are our support systems. It might be one person, it might be three, it might be five, and that's okay. But let's write down your support systems and even their numbers right there, just so you know right there I can call them at any time. Also looking at, making sure you have your toolkit of things that you do, those strategies we talked about, those coping skills. I always like to give clients resources, whether it be an app, whether it be websites, whether it be TED Talks, whether it be podcasts, whatever interests that person, whatever their medium of things that they like to do is. It could even be that they like watching documentaries. So I try to find clients things that they can learn from. And that's called psychoeducation. That's a huge part of therapy, is that sometimes we don't know what we don't know. We have to learn about healing. We have to learn about mental health. We have to learn about diagnoses and strategies. And so I like to encourage homework exercises and just different, I call it activities, outside activities, and to learn and grow throughout that time. And they can also provide support. Also making sure we provide, crisis lines. Sometimes people might not be in a safe space. And also I always try to encourage and provide clients with information if they are not feeling okay. But also I think if a person feels that they might need consistent support, talking to their therapist or counselor about, what does their insurance look like? Maybe weekly sessions are best, maybe twice weekly sessions if that counselor therapist can support that in their schedule at first. And then you begin to go to once weekly, and then you move on to bi-weekly. And so I think that, it's important to look at what the client's needs are and work with them on that when it comes to session frequency. And as they begin to accomplish goals, you begin to step it down a little bit. But also making sure that client is full of just information, and you provide them resources, and making sure that they can verbalize their resources and support and who they can turn to.
So, Dr. Layne, thank you for the abundance of tools and techniques that one can use. But I want to ask this question also. What happens if the individual is not in places where they can implement those, right? Like, are there any techniques and tools that you would give someone, like if they was just out and about, they didn't have a TV, they didn't have someone to call at that moment, but they just got stuck in that moment, there was this trigger and they felt lost?
If a client, does have religious belief and faith, I encourage them to use their spirituality. There can be so much peace there for people and leaning on that. So I encourage people to tap into mindfulness when it comes to prayer, or if they have a certain scripture they like to recite often, encourage my clients to have some sort of positive affirmation, whether it's a quote, scripture, even if it's just a word that you can connect to your brain, that your brain knows, oh, happy, and that just, even just something that small can change those brain waves and patterns and may excite some sort of feeling better. Also, encourage clients that it is okay to take a moment. That's what I call it. And that could be taking a moment and going to your car, excusing yourself from the table and going to the bathroom. If you need that alone time, it is okay to take it. Also, I encourage people that talk about it if you have to. Even if you're at dinner with 5 friends, it's okay to acknowledge and express, hey, I'm having a rough time right now, if you feel comfortable. But it can be so healing to just express that. And especially, those people that are there in your support, they're going to be supportive of you and help you through it. And so you don't always have to take the moment and go away. You can verbalize it as well. And, so those are just different ways, using our self-talk, using different deep breathing and breaths. Stretching is what I like to do. If I have something in my mind, I'll do my neck and I'll stretch. People probably just think I'm just popping my neck. But sometimes I'm actually taking my moment and let's get the tension off.
I want to ask you a question. I know, I see often that people reach out and they talk about a life coach. And so just to be able to give our listeners an understanding of the difference, if there may be one, between a life coach and a therapist, and or how they both can work hand in hand if necessary.
A therapist is, a counselor or a social worker or someone in psychology that has been trained, has a graduate degree. A licensed counselor or a licensed therapist is someone in those fields that has gone on after their graduate degree to have more supervision experience and to go on to have that state licensure. And so when you're looking at choosing a therapist versus a life coach or what type of provider you would like to see, it's important to look at what your needs are. I like to say, life coaches are amazing. They are more for your basic life things. Life coaches do work on goals and do assist, but when it comes to mental health, a counselor and/or a therapist and/or a clinical social worker or psychologist, they have been trained to help a person through mental health and clinical concerns, and that's the difference. Or if you don't have a diagnosis for mental health, you can still go see a counselor or therapist and go a little bit more deeper than do life coaches.
So, Dr. Layne, as we are at the end of our episode today, I always ask my guests, what is one heart-to-heart message that you would share for our listeners today as we navigate the space of grief and healing and seeking professional help from a therapist?
I want listeners to know that it can get better. It does get better. And that sometimes for it to get better, we need help. And it's okay to reach out for support and help, even if you don't know what support and help you need. A counselor or therapist or that you trust can help you navigate that. But I think it's just taking that step and saying, I'm hurting, I'm going through something and I just need help. And so I'd like to encourage all the listeners to, please don't be afraid to reach out if you are struggling through grief or struggling with mental health concerns that, can come about because of grief. Please make sure to reach out and that it can get better with support.
So, Dr. Layne, as we are at the end of our show today, I want you to be able to share with our guests how they can find Dr. Layne.
I am from Imagine Counseling Services. I'm the owner and licensed professional counselor. You can find me at imaginecounseling1@gmail.com. You can also go to our website. It's imaginecounselingservices.org.
So again, Dr. Layne, I want to thank you for taking your time out today to share your expertise with our audience. I know what you have shared today will make a great impact on those who are dealing with grief, healing, as well as overcoming unforeseen circumstances. So again, thank you for all that you do.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning into Heart to Heart with Keisha B. Remember, grief may shape our journey, but it doesn't define who we are. Healing is not a straight path, but with every step forward, you're creating space for hope, strength, and new beginnings. If today's episode brought you comfort or clarity, share it with someone who might need it too. Let's continue building this community of compassion and resilience together. Until next time, take care of your heart, your mind, and your soul. Honor your journey and always know that brighter days are ahead. I am Keisha B, and this has been Heart to Heart.